Hello and welcome to chapter 3 where we're talking about ecosystems, what they are and how they work. So know that an ecosystem is taking a look at living organisms and how they interact with the living and non-living parts of their environment. So we often use these terms biotic and abiotic when we're referring to the living biotic and non-living parts of an environment. And one of the key themes of this chapter is that everything's connected. We're going to be talking about cycles, like the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and we're going to take a look at how organisms play a role, how abiotic and biotic factors contribute, along with ourselves as humans. What are the human impacts on these natural earth systems? So let's get started. Our core case study is a great start to our chapter where we're taking a look at the effects of deforestation. So know that the tropical rainforests, where we find about the equator of our planet, are very important ecologically speaking. They contain up to 1/2 of the world's known terrestrial plant and animal species, but they only cover about 2% of Earth's land. And so it's a very biodiverse area that we need to protect. So you can take a look at this core case study and see some of the effects that deforestation is having on this habitat. So this is an example of natural capital degradation. Starting off the chapter, we take a look at Earth's structure and how its 4 major components, the 4 spheres, allow for these systems to support life. So know these spheres: the atmosphere is the air, hydrosphere is made of the water, the biosphere contain the living components, and the geosphere contains the rocks, minerals, and the soil that we find on our planet. When we take a look at the structure of our planet, know that the biosphere can inhabit only certain parts of the planet, right? You don't find living things in the core and the mantle, but you find living organisms on Earth's surface, even within the soil and within the atmosphere. So if you consider each of these spheres, some important things to know: the atmosphere is made up of layers. We'll need to review those layers. The innermost layer is called the troposphere, and that is the air that we breathe. And that has a different composition than the other layers of the atmosphere. Another important layer of the atmosphere is called the stratosphere. So let me write these down. And so it's in the stratosphere that we find this ozone layer. Ozone is a molecule that's made up of 3 oxygen atoms bonded together. And that plays an important role when we're talking about UV radiation and filtering that UV radiation from the sun. A little bit about the hydrosphere. That's where we find water. Water can be found in different forms on our planet. It can be found as a vapor, in liquid state, or solid state as ice. And it's important to know that our ocean contains 97% of the planet's water. So 97% of those water molecules are found in the ocean. The geosphere, again, coming back to this part of the diagram, is the upper portion of the crust, and it's going to contain nutrients along with organisms, and it also contains those non-renewable fossil fuels that we've talked about previously. And of course, the biosphere, those are the living components, and those are found, like I said before, in the atmosphere, on Earth's surface, and within the soil. So the biosphere is found in all of these other spheres. So if you take a look at this next sticky note, we have the 3 factors that describe the components of the system that allows it to support life. So know that we have energy coming in from the sun, and that solar energy is driving all of these cycles and living organisms. we see that in these cycles, we have a fixed amount of matter that's cycling. So atoms that make up you and the things around you have always been part of our system. So think of the law of conservation of mass. We're not creating atoms and molecules out of thin air, but rather they're rearranging over time. So it's pretty crazy to think about. Also know gravity is an important force that enables the movement of cycling of chemicals throughout all of these spheres, and that includes throughout organisms as well. So the greenhouse effect, this is uber important. You guys have probably heard of this phenomenon before. If not, please review it. So know the greenhouse gases. Some of the major ones you guys think of are carbon dioxide, CO2. So know the role of greenhouse gases and how they contribute to this greenhouse effect that occurs on our planet. So in this next section, we're taking a dive into ecology. What is an ecosystem? There's a lot of vocabulary terms. Some of these terms you're probably familiar with. Review them and write down the definitions of the new ones. So people who study ecology are called ecologists, and they study at different levels throughout this system. So we can consider the 5 different levels being the biosphere, ecosystems, communities, populations, and then the organism itself. So it depends what level you are most interested in, but know that we go from big to small down here. Right, so organisms make up a population. Populations collectively make up a community. When you have several communities interacting, it's an ecosystem, and then all of that compounds together to make up the biosphere. Taking a look at this sticky note right here, we see that energy moves through trophic levels. So trophic level is basically what feeding level the organism is part of. So organisms are classified as either producers or consumers based on where they get their nutrients. So producers might be like grass. So we know grass is photosynthetic, and it converts that solar energy into chemical energy through photosynthesis. Then we have an herbivore coming along, and it's going to consume this producer. So that would be an example of a primary consumer, or an herbivore in this case. And the energy gets transferred up that food chain. So it's important to know what trophic level or feeding level an organism is a part of, and that will give you information about where it's getting its nutrients from. So we had a little bit of room to write out our equation for photosynthesis. You guys should be familiar with the equation of photosynthesis along with aerobic respiration, which is essentially taking these products over here and converting them into the reactants. It's what we say more or less the opposite of each other, but they're not chemical opposites of each other. So be familiar with those equations. Know that glucose is this molecule C6H12O6. On this next page, we look at some decomposers. So you probably think of like fungi. There are bacteria as well. And these decomposers play a huge role in the cycling of matter. So these are consumers that release the nutrients from waste or remains of plants or animals. So once they're spent their lifetime on the planet and they become dead, these organisms will come in and they're going to consume those waste products and get them back into the cycle in a usable form for other organisms to use. If you think of soil, so soil is not just dirt. Soil is an example of a renewable resource, and it's a mixture of all of these things together. It's pretty awesome to think that soil is more than just dirt. It contains living organisms, it contains organic matter, lots of minerals. It's pretty foundational to sustaining life on our planet, along with these microorganisms on the next page. So microorganisms, teeny tiny organisms that are too tiny to see by our naked eye. play a huge role in ecosystems and provide many ecosystem services. So know that microorganisms, there are good or beneficial forms of microorganisms. If you think of bacteria, so your digestive system is lined with bacteria. You guys use bacteria to help you digest your food, and hopefully your digestive system is made up of these healthy type of bacteria. But we know that there are some harmful bacteria that can cause us to get sick or get infections. So when you think about the impact they have on a particular organism, you can classify them as either being beneficial or harmful. When we're taking a look at ecosystems and how these organisms interact with each other, we can often describe their relationship in a food chain that shows the movement of energy and nutrients from one trophic level to the next. So you could see a food chain here where we have this photosynthetic organism being eaten by an herbivore, which might be the zebra here. And then maybe the zebra is then eaten by a lion or something, and then eventually it decomposes and gets cycled back into the environment. All of these steps, as you may notice, release heat energy. So that's bringing back this idea, the law of, so the second law of thermodynamics describes how this quality of energy through additional energy transfers increases the entropy or randomness. So we have this release of energy as heat energy that's not usable by the system, which shows that, excuse me, whenever energy is transformed, there's a loss of energy, and that's through the release of this heat. And so this occurs between each trophic level, and we can see this illustrated in this food web. So know that every use and transfer of energy involves energy losses, heat in the system. On this next page, we are taking a look at the 10% rule. So if you look at this figure over here, we can organize this energy transfer into this pyramid type of diagram. And this pyramid shows the flow of energy in a system. And we see that 90% of usable energy is lost with each transfer. So that means that only 10% is transferred to the next level. So that means that there's less chemical energy for these higher trophic levels. So if you look at the amount of biomass or the total mass of organisms in a given trophic level, you can see that there's a very large amount of biomass at the bottom, the base of this pyramid, where the producers are. In this case, it's phytoplankton, because we're looking at a marine ecosystem. And then we get smaller and smaller amounts because we have this 10% rule. So there are additional diagrams we can look at that show specifically biomass throughout these trophic levels. This diagram shows the amount of usable energy, in particular how it relates to this 10% energy rule. When we're looking at ecosystems, it's not often best summarized as a food chain, because usually we have an organism that is able to consume more than one type of other organisms. And so we usually fall into this category of food webs. And what's important is that when you are building or interpreting a food web, you are drawing the arrow of the food towards the consumer. So you're showing that the energy of the food, in this case the krill, is being eaten by the blue whale. So the energy that was stored in this krill is going to this blue whale. So make sure the arrows are pointing in the right direction. It shows the transfer of energy. On our next page, we have two new terms, GPP and NPP. So GPP is gross primary productivity, and this is a measurement, the units are written here, kilocalories per meter squared per year. And this describes the rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert the solar energy to the stored chemical energy that then becomes usable by the ecosystem. So it's a rate of productivity, primary productivity, because you're looking at your primary producers and the efficiency or the rate at which they're converting solar to chemical energy. The NPP term, net primary productivity, is related to GPP, but in this case it is a rate at which the ecosystem's producers convert solar energy to chemical energy minus the rate at which they use that stored energy for aerobic respiration. So it's the net, or what's left over after the organisms in the ecosystem are respiring and using that chemical energy. So ecosystems that have very high net primary productivity are ecosystems that are very productive, and they're so productive that there's this extra usable chemical energy for other organisms and ecosystems to use. So you can compare the NPP, the net primary productivity of ecosystems, to each other, and we see this graph does that. And they're classified into two categories. So we're comparing terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And what we're seeing is that there are some aquatic systems that are very productive. And some terrestrial ecosystems are also very productive. And collectively, the planet's NPP ultimately limits the number of consumers, and that includes us, that can survive on the Earth. So remember, our source of energy is the sun, and we can't use that energy from the sun. We can't just lay out in the sun and get our food. We rely on other organisms that can use that energy and convert it into something that's usable by others. So back on this page, let's take a look at ecological efficiency, an important term to know and use. So know that ecological efficiency is the percent of energy transferred from one trophic level to the next in an ecosystem. And we've talked about this. It's about 10% according to that 10% rule. But know that most of this energy is lost as heat, and that's waste. You also want to consider that some energy contained in detritus and metabolic waste, like feces, also provide energy for decomposers and detrivores, which are part of ecosystems as well. Okay, so moving on to our cycles, we in APES take a deep look at these four main cycles involving carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water. So know that the cycles are driven by incoming solar energy and also gravity, and that human activity can alter these cycles. And we're going to be taking a look at some of the human impacts for each of these. So the hydrologic cycle, it's going to collect, purify, and distribute our fixed amount of water that we have on our planet. So the incoming solar energy causes evaporation of water, and it's the gravity that draws the water back down as precipitation. So know that surface runoff evaporates as well, and some participation is stored as groundwater. So review this diagram. A lot of these should be familiar processes, but also know the human impact, so how humans impact the hydrologic cycle as well. That includes drawing large amounts of fresh water from these reservoirs faster than nature can replace it. It includes clearing vegetation, which increases runoff. It also includes draining and filling wetlands for farming and urban development. And wetlands are pretty important. They provide flood control. They kind of act as like a sponge that allows them to hold overflows of water. So keep in mind these natural processes that are occurring along with the human impacts. Next up, we have the carbon cycle, and know that carbon is the basic building block of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, DNA, and other organic compounds. Also know photosynthesis is important in the carbon cycle, so we know that photosynthesis is done by producers, and these organisms are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which we know is an important greenhouse gas. Aerobic respiration is also very relevant. So aerobic respiration is done by both producers, consumers, and decomposers, and all of that is adding carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere. We see that some carbon dioxide does dissolve into the ocean and can be stored in marine sediments. And when we're talking about the carbon cycle, we often classify different parts of it as either sinks or sources. So sinks are these different parts where we can find carbon staying long periods of time, like the ocean, plants, soil. And then the sources are adding carbon into the system, in particular into the atmosphere, in this case where we have the burning of fossil fuels or the combustion of anything like fire, that's adding carbon into the atmosphere in that case. So for the carbon cycle, you guys have heard this before. Humans have added large quantities of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and it's occurring at a faster rate than it has before. Much faster than natural processes can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So these levels have been increasingly quite dramatically since about 1960, and ultimately the result of this leads to the warming of the atmosphere and the changing climate. So you guys have heard of global climate change. There's a lot of scientific evidence that supports that carbon dioxide is playing a key role, and that our human activity is manipulating this carbon cycle in a significant way. Another thing, another example of human impact on the carbon cycle would be clearing vegetation, which reduces the ability of excess carbon to be removed from the atmosphere. So if we are chopping down plants that are photosynthesizing, normally removing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but we're killing those plants, they're not able to do that ecosystem service. Next up, we have the nitrogen cycle. So this one might be kind of new. Know that nitrogen makes up the majority of the atmosphere. So nitrogen gas, N2, makes up a lot of our atmosphere, 78%. And we can't use this nitrogen gas. It's not considered like a usable form. So what's usable are molecules that are derivatives of that. So nitrogen is transformed into more usable forms by lightning, by specialized bacteria. We call those nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Those guys live in the topsoil and the bottom sediment of aquatic systems. The usable forms of nitrogen are also used by plants to produce proteins, nucleic acids, and vitamins. And I know we talked about nitrogen-fixing bacteria. We also have bacteria that convert nitrogen compounds back into nitrogen gas. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria would convert the nitrogen gas into usable forms, and then we have bacteria that convert it back as well. So some of the ways in which the human population is altering the nitrogen cycle includes burning of fossil fuels. So when we burn gasoline and other fuels, we're creating nitric oxide, and that could return back to the environment as acid rain. We're removing large amounts of nitrogen from the atmosphere to make fertilizers for agricultural purposes. We're adding excess nitrates into aquatic systems through, runoff and fertilizer. And human nitrogen inputs in the environment have been rising sharply and are expected to continue rising because of these practices. We're going to continue to burn fossil fuels probably, and we're going to continue to use fertilizers and these agricultural practices unless we do something different. So our last cycle is the phosphorus cycle. And it's important to know that phosphorus cycles through water, through Earth's crust, and living organisms. So the atmosphere is not playing a role in this cycle. Know that the major reservoir is phosphate rocks, so rocks contain phosphate. And this is a very slow cycle, and that's because weathering and erosion and plate tectonics, those are all slow processes, so we don't see a lot of turnover of phosphorus as quickly as others. So know some examples of human activities that impact this cycle. It includes the clearing of forests, removing large amounts of phosphate from the earth to make these fertilizers, and erosion leaches phosphates into streams. So we have phosphates entering the waterways as well, which contribute to increase of algae growth. So that runoff can come from, that runoff that's rich in phosphates could come from fertilizer or sewage or even mining waste. Okay, last section of our book takes a look at how scientists study ecology. So there are basically different methods of study. We can do field research, we can do research in the lab, we can use models and mathematical practices to describe these systems. All of them have their pros and cons. You should be able to know what's what. So field research, we're out in nature or in a system, and we can use tools like satellites, GPS, GIS. We can even use aircrafts, but we use these tools to figure out where animals go and what they do. In the lab, we try to simplify the systems with controlled variables and understand the relationship by executing a controlled experiment in the lab. And this experimentation is then supported by field research as well. So there are some pros and cons to lab research as well. There are some mathematical models that can simulate ecosystem dynamics, and it's a great way to study large and complex systems where we can't simplify them into these very simple experiments. So mathematical models are helpful as well. So if we go back to this scientific focus 3.2, we see this new term called Anthropocene, and that is a term we use to describe this new time period we're in, our era. And it's named this way because of human impact. So this root refers to humans, and this period is viewed as a period where human activity is playing a profound role in what we're seeing on our planet today. As you wrap up your chapter, take a look at your glossary of terms, these key ideas. Take a look at your checkpoint questions. Make sure you answer those in your notes. And we have some more math review here on percent change and percent difference. So some more dimensional analysis. Always include your units. Those are great problems to walk through. So great job. Hope you guys have a great day.